overview of what I'm going to be addressing today. I'll give you an introduction. After that, I'll talk about maturity rating systems. Since they're quite related, they're kind of the core of what we're going to be talking about. I'll talk about the Ohio corn performance test with regard to early corn hybrids, advantages and disadvantages of ultra early corn hybrids. And you know, if I'd known that if I could get a crowd this large talking about ultra early corn, I'd do it more often. It's not a topic that I thought was a real crowd drawer. Okay, then I'll talk about past research on ultra early corn, the 2016 ultra early corn hybrid evaluation, and then some conclusions. A challenge to successful cover crop establishment in Ohio is the relatively narrow window for planting cover crops after corn harvest in the fall. And planting ultra early hybrids results in an earlier corn harvest that may allow earlier corn crop seeding and establishment, and to give the crop some time to grow. The goal of the project I'll be talking about is to determine if ultra early hybrids that are much earlier than the hybrids we commonly grow in Ohio, or commonly grown maturities, offer advantages in cover cropping systems for corn production. First, let's talk about some hybrid maturity ratings. I know a lot of this is a review for you, but just so we're on the same page, let's talk about this. We've got relative maturity days. This is what we use 99% of the time, isn't it? Seedman comes to us, talks about 111-day hybrids, 109-day hybrids within their lineup, and you have a pretty good idea what they're talking about. Then we have the heat unit system, growing degree days, and a lot of companies provide that information as well. We've got grain moisture at harvest, and that's good information. You can get that from the corn performance test. You know, we include grain moisture. You know, usually when grain moisture drops below 20%, though, if your test average is, say, 18 or 19%, or it's of limited value. Because when we're harvesting a test and it comes out that with those types of moisture levels, it's hard to distinguish. But if you got a test where there's an average that's above 20%, that's a good way to shake out differences in hybrid maturity based on grain moisture. We've got days to mid-soak. Some companies provide that. That's a good system. And then there's test weight at harvest. You know, the heavier test weights, higher test weights.
You've got to click this.
Hybrids. So the days to maturity rating system, again, the one you're familiar with, this is based on comparison with hybrids of no maturity.
That was my mission.
And really based on relative maturities, relative differences within a group of hybrids, you know, usually within a company's lineup for grain harvest and moisture. It's not calendar-based, of course. It's not a predictive tool. It's not going to tell you how many days from planting to harvest that a corn hybrid has. It's strictly useful as a comparative measurement. The GDD system, it's a quantitative system. Each corn hybrid requires a certain number of accumulated GDDs to reach maturity. It's usually consistent from location to location, environment to environment. There's some changes that corn hybrids can adjust to when they're planting late and they require fewer GDDs. The GDD calculation method most commonly used in the U.S. is the 8650 cutoff method. Now, just across the lake, the Canadians use the Ontario heat unit system. That's kind of complicated. They use logarithms. You know, that's kind of something we want to stay away from. GDDs are calculated as the average daily temperature minus 50. If the maximum temperature is greater than 86, 86 is used to determine the daily average. Corn basically, the rate of growth ceases at 86 and then basically stops at 86. And then same with temperatures of the minimum temperature is less than 50 degrees. 50 is used to determine the daily average. So again, something many of you just review for you. Well, what are ultra early hybrids in Ohio? This is kind of the meat of it.
That might be a good idea.
Commonly grown hybrids in the state are, I would say, typically 105 to 114 days. Now, this is not cast in stone. They're cast in concrete. This is just my assessment from years of working with corn hybrids. This changes. A number of years ago, I probably would have used I might have said 104, maybe 115 days, but right now that's kind of what I went with. That corresponds to approximately 2,500 to 2,800 GDDs. The ultra early hybrids, these are very, very early hybrids as I see it. These have maturity less than 100 days. Typically less than 2,400 heat units required. So that's that range of GDDs, our ultra early hybrids we're going to be talking about today, typically 90 to 100 days, 2150 to 2450 growing degree days. It's a lot less than we typically use. And that these GDD, these relative maturity ratings for these hybrids, it's going to vary a little bit across the state, from north to south, northwest to northeast. You know, when I was up in a meeting in Ashtabula County, they actually use 90 to 100 day hybrids up there. They're right across the border from Pennsylvania. 90 to 100 day hybrids work fine for them up there. They actually had a very good year growing season this year, and like some of us in the central part of the state, you know, they were pulling out yields of well over 200 bushels with those 90 to 100 day hybrids. Just a little bit of a digression. Okay, this figure shows the relative maturity of corn hybrids, or the relative maturity of hybrid entries in our corn performance test. This is a test we run every year. This is the bulletin that comes out in Ohio's Country Farmer in early December. It's available on the web in early and late November. And what we're looking at here are the entries, the relative maturity of entries in two of our northern regions. The northeast, north central region is at the top, and the northwest region is at the bottom of the figure. And each, the northwest, northeast, north central region had 121 entries. The northwest region had 162. The red bars indicate the early season corn test, hybrid test, and the gray bar indicates the full season test. I can actually use that. Now the 109 is the breakout point. If the hybrid's 109 or greater, it's in our full season test. If it's 109 or less than 109, it's in our short season test. Now, what's interesting here to me is that in recent years, we've seen some changes in our hybrid lineup, our early maturity hybrids. Not that many years ago, we didn't have that many hybrids in the test that were characterized as less than 104 days maturity, days of maturity. And in 2016, we had 27 entries in the test that were 100 to 104 day maturities in our test. Actually, not that many years ago, I would have considered 100 to 104 days kind of a, I wouldn't necessarily call it ultra early, but I would have called it very early, maybe not a commonly grown maturity. Because I would have considered the commonly grown maturities hybrids greater than, say, 105. But now that we're seeing more of these hybrids in that 100 to 104 day range, I'm thinking maybe we should be considering those short season hybrids our early hybrids. So I'm lumping them into with the commonly grown maturities, although I still think they're on the early side. Okay, what about hybrids less than 100 days? Well, in our corn performance test in the northeast region, we just had 3 entries that were that low, as far as that had that few number of growing, that had that relative maturity range, less than 100, and only 1 at the northwest region. So we really don't have a lot of information in our corn performance test on hybrids less than 100 days, but we do have information now, a lot more information than we did in the past, on hybrids that were less than 105 days. We have a lot of these hybrids in the range of 100 to 104 days, which are our early hybrids. They mature a lot earlier. So let's take a look at some of these. Okay, this is a figure that shows the relationship of relative maturity to grain moisture in our northwest test this past year. And this figure, there's a lot of scatter here, and what we're looking at here is relative maturity on our x-axis, and we've got grain moisture on the y-axis. And we say our grain moisture is ranging from, a little above 15% up to about 23%. We really didn't have the range in grain moisture we might have because we had a pretty good fall. It was pretty warm and dry actually for us. The crop dried down pretty quickly, so we didn't have the range in grain moistures that we might have in, say, in pastures where we've been harvesting at moisture levels closer to, say, 20% or above. But nevertheless, our trend line and our R-squared, our value tells us there's a pretty good, we're accounting for a lot of variation in grain moisture with relative maturity ratings. So our relative maturities that are, say, our 115 or our 114, 113 day hybrids are in that 22% range, and our early hybrids, like the 98 day hybrid here, is like a little below 16%. Okay, let's look at the relationship of yield to relative maturity. Because, many years we actually find that our early maturing hybrids yield as well or about the same, or sometimes even a little better than our full season hybrids. That's kind of a surprise to people because intuitively you think, well, our full season hybrids, can use more of the growing season, and as a result, they have an opportunity to produce. There's more grain fill, and as a result, there's the potential for higher yields. But that's not always the case. And as this figure sort of shows that, even though 2016, you know, as we may have forgotten, but it was a warm, especially hot, dry year in parts of northwest Ohio, especially in June and July. Very dry. We thought our yields could really take a hit this year, a major hit. And we were lucky we got out of many fields. We did as well as we did. But this is what the relationship to, this figure shows the relationship to yield. A lot of scatter in our points. Again, each one of these points indicates a hybrid, or across 3 locations, an average across 3 locations. And our R-squared value telling us is this, you know, about the relationship, how strong this relationship would indicate. This is a weak relationship between maturity and yield. We're not accounting for a lot of yield differences in yield with maturity here in the Northwest region. Again, doesn't surprise me. Okay, let's look at the North Central, Northeast region of the state. Again, the relationship between grain moistures, no surprise here. Our grain moisture variation was a little greater here. So it's a strong relationship. You know, we had hybrids down here around, hybrids that were down to, we had one that was like a 94-day hybrid, and it had moisture levels that were like 17% versus say close to above 24% for our late maturing 114-day hybrids. So relationship that you'd expect. Now, because of those hot, dry conditions I mentioned that we experienced in northeast Ohio and parts of northeast Ohio, we didn't see as flat a response to relative maturity as I was mentioning, as I was indicating for the Northwest. Here we saw a stronger relationship, but not a, you know, our trend line indicates a stronger relationship. Still a lot of scatter in our points. You know, it's nothing definitive as far as relationship with grain moisture, with yield relationship with relative maturity. But the trend line would suggest maybe about a 2.2 bushel increase for each day of relative maturity. So as we're increasing it, we have that about our slope would indicate that potential exists, but it's not very strong. Now another way to look at this is the relationship of grain moisture at harvest to grain yield in our tests. And if you look at this shows the relationship of grain moisture to harvest grain moisture to grain yield in the Northwest region. And you see there's little or no relationship between harvest moisture and yield in this figure. Harvest moisture, again, is, in this case, it's on the x-axis, or yields are on the y-axis. So we're not looking at relative maturity, we're actually looking at grain moisture, harvest grain moisture for these hybrids in the field. That's for the Northwest. The North Central, Northeast region, there's a little more of a relationship there. But still, it's not as strong a relationship as you might think, or as sometimes we think about with regard to maturity effects on yield. Okay, so what are why are we talking about ultra-early hybrids? We have the early hybrids in our trials. What do the ultra-early hybrids offer us over what we currently have available? Well, they mature earlier. Instead of harvesting hybrids, say in late September, early October, they might give us an opportunity to harvest hybrids corn in early September. So mature earlier, dry down faster. They could offer higher prices and premiums for early deliveries. There's some elevators in Northeast Ohio this past year that were offering, I think, 30 cents for early September deliveries. They run out of grain. And more, especially from the standpoint of this group here, they might have an important advantage because they might allow livestock producers to apply manure earlier and plant cover crops in these early harvested cornfields and give that cover crop a chance to grow. Disadvantages, well, in the past, I put question marks by these statements under disadvantages because these are based on perceptions from the past. When I was first here in Ohio back in the early 90s, when we talk about an early hybrid like this, for somebody who was planting really late in the season or something, or had a special situation, they were regarded as kind of having negligible performance. A common phrase might have been for these lower yielding hybrids was 98 days or 98 bushels, because they weren't seen as having much potential. They were perceived as more vulnerable to heat and drought stress. They were perceived as more susceptible to diseases and insects, and the stock and grain quality was considered marginal. Once in a while we'd pull down a hybrid from northern Michigan, we'd grow it in our test, and it would just fall apart compared to our other hybrids. But what's happened in the last 20 years or so, even more I think, is that the corn breeders, geneticists, have done a phenomenal job at improving the agronomic performance of short season corns. They're making them more competitive and and especially more competitive with commonly grown maturities, the 105 to the 114 day hybrids we typically grow, within a zone of adaptation. And there's other factors. The transgenic insect resistance we have now has certainly helped as well. But to just demonstrate how successful they've been at improving the genetics and the yield potential of ultra early hybrids, I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago in Ottawa, and we had a lot of folks from Manitoba there, and they're really pushing corn in Manitoba, Canada, and it's coming out of their canola and wheat acres. And their acreage isn't huge, but just in the last year, their acreage has increased 30% from 2015, and in 2016 they grew 325,000 acres of corn for grain. They actually import grain into Manitoba. They've got an ethanol plant, they run out of grain there. But they're growing 79-day hybrids, and their yields, their average yields are probably about 150 bushels, but they have growers that are getting yields of over 200 bushels. So, that shows you the breeders have done a phenomenal job at developing hybrids that can tolerate very short growing seasons, or handle very short growing seasons. Well, another problem, though, with ultra-early hybrids is there's limited information concerning the agronomic performance of these hybrids. There's really no incentive for companies to market early corn hybrids in Ohio. And as a result, the reliable seed supply of early hybrids in Ohio is limited. We've seen that in years where, back in 2009, when we were planting a lot of corn, most of our corn got planted after June 1st. And some growers were planting as late as June 15th. They wanted really early hybrids because we couldn't convince them to stay with the commonly grown maturity hybrids because they were concerned about grain moisture. And we just couldn't find the high-yielding early season hybrids they were looking for because the supply was very limited. Now, ultra-early hybrids have gotten some good press recently. I find articles like this one, with statements like this in these articles, in trade magazine articles, in the farm magazines. Hybrids with maturities from 83 to 97 days out-yield full-season hybrids, 107 to 111-day hybrids, and on-farm tests in Pennsylvania. And then seed companies and grower reports in the eastern U.S. report that short-season hybrids, these ultra-early hybrids, are highly advantageous for cover crop establishment. They see cover crops growers as a niche market for them because they have lower grain moisture at harvest. So they're getting their attention from that standpoint. Well, so what sort of information do we have available on ultra-early hybrids? We do have some previous OSU evaluations that have looked at ultra-early and short-season corn hybrids. We conducted a trial in 2005 and 2006. Yeah, it's over 10 years ago, and compared short-season hybrids, 87 to 104-day hybrids, and commonly grown maturities. In this case, the Czechs hybrids we used were 106 to 112 days, planted in early to mid-June. And the reason we did that, again, we were focusing on these scenarios where we're planting a lot of corn late in the season, like after late May or early June, because we've had a very wet May and we can't get into the field. And so we end up planting corn after June 1st. So as we were taking a look at these ultra-early hybrids to see if they might be an alternative, and short-season hybrids to see if they might be an alternative to our commonly grown maturities. I want to mention, emphasize that we can usually grow our commonly grown maturities in those late planting situations, but the grain moisture levels can be higher than these ultra-earlies at harvest. In 2009 and 2010, we compared two short-season corns, at 102, 104, and two full-season corns, 109, 111, and recent and current evaluations that we're conducting are considering hybrids ranging in maturity from 102 to 114 days. Typically now, when we do a study on whether it's drought tolerance, row spacing, the seed companies we work with actually specify a very early hybrid, and one of the typically a 102-day hybrid. So in the past, as I said before, I would have considered an 102-day hybrid very early, but now they're considering them almost like a commonly grown maturity. And these studies I'm going to be talking about, the one that was done, I'll show you in a minute here, was 30,000 back in 2006, but we've increased the population in the more recent study. I think it was 34,000. That was our seeding rate. Okay, this is our our late planted corn test from 2005, 2006. And that year, in these years, we looked at 3 Ohio sites: South Charleston, Whiteville, and Apple Creek in northwest, southwest, northwest, and northeast Ohio, respectively. The seeding rate for this study back in 2005, 2006 was 30,000 plants per acre. We were using planting dates of June 9th. Harvest dates were anywhere from November 3rd, November 2nd to December 13th, so they were late harvested. We only used the BT corns because in these late planting situations, it really behooves you to use hybrids that have resistance to corn borer, because that, corn borer is basically extinct. I think the new president will take it off the endangered species list, corn borers, but I shouldn't get into that. But then there's also the problem with western bean cutworm, which is coming down the road, and it also favors these late season corn planting. So again, the VIP traits that are available would be good for these types of situations. Okay, this late planted corn test we did in 2005 and 2006. In 2005 and 2006, we had 5 Czech hybrids, and they were 108 to 111 day relative maturities. The hybrids that were less than 100 days, they ranged from 2006, 3 to 7 in 2005. And most of our hybrids were in the range of 100 to 104. We had 17 in 2005, and we had 13 in 2006. So we were looking a little bit more at these earlier hybrids, the 100 to 104 day hybrids, but we have some data on the short season, the ultra earlies. Okay, so this is how these relative maturity days have corresponded to our GDDs associated with each of these hybrids. Because you look at a hybrid that would be, say, 100 day, and we look at this is the GDDs that were associated with it. So less than 100, they were using 2,500. Those of you may remember earlier on, I was saying 2,400. So these numbers kind of float around. 100 to 102, 2,500 to 2,530, 103 to 104, 2,450 to 2,550. You notice there's a lot of overlap, or there's not a lot of consistency between growing degree days and GDDs. And then the 108 to 111 day hybrids, 2,650 to 2,750. Okay, let's look at the relationship of yield to relative maturity. And here we're looking at 2005, 2006. The x-axis, our horizontal axis, is relative maturity from about 86 to 110. And we're looking at yield there in the y-axis. And I put circles around the 3 groups that I'm interested in. Our trend lines for both 2005 and 2006 our square values indicate there's really not that much, a real strong relationship between relative maturity and yield. Certainly the hybrids in the 100 to 104 day range, the scatter there you can see is very comparable to our Czech hybrids. And I should have mentioned, our Czech hybrids were not dogs. We were selecting hybrids that were the highest yielding hybrids in our tests for a 2-year period. So these were elite hybrids, had very high yield potential. So they were these ultra early hybrids that we were pitting against these, or the annual short season hybrids that we're comparing against our Czech hybrids were hybrids that had good performance. So you can see that they were not that great a difference in yield. Okay. What we found surprising in this test, though, and I did mention the last one, the 2005 were the red diamonds, and the 2006 were the black squares for 2005 and 2006, respectively. Here we're looking at the relationship of stock lodging. Now, this was a characteristic that many years ago, say back in the late 80s and late 90s, when I first started, thinking, when people were talking about ultra early hybrids once in a while, this was a characteristic we usually thought, well, this stock quality is a real problem with these hybrids. And yet, in these 2 years, and of course, limited number of locations, and the seed companies would have a lot more data, of course, but we found that in 2006, especially when we had some pretty significant stock lodging problems, that they didn't exhibit lodging pressure that was or lodging damage, percent lodging that was any greater than our Czech hybrids. So that was interesting. 2005, we didn't have a lot of lodging pressure. It was less than 10%. But again, we didn't see any evidence that the lodging problems were greater with these short season and ultra early hybrids than our Czech hybrids. So just some closing comments about this test. Again, it's over 10 years old, but just kind of provides us with some baseline information. Early hybrids are available with yields comparable to commonly grown maturities. The grain moisture of these early hybrids was typically 3 to 5% lower than our commonly grown maturities. The 100 to 104-day hybrids showed higher yield potential than those that were less than 100 days. And most of the hybrids exhibited stock lodging that was similar to our commonly grown maturities, at least based on these 6 site years that we looked at. Okay, let me just make a comment about some other studies we've done with short season hybrids. I mentioned one in 2009 and 2010. We compared the agronomic performance of 2 short season hybrids, 102 and 104, 2 full season hybrids, 109 and 111. These all came from the same company. They all were pretty good yielding hybrids based on our corn performance test. They were planted across a range of plant populations in early May and early June. And what was interesting was the 102-day hybrid produced yields comparable to or exceeding the yields of the full season hybrids at similar plant populations. So, you know, that there are certain hybrids out there, some of these early hybrids that are available for growers if they are in some of these cover crop situations that might, you know, if they're not going to look at an ultra early hybrid, there's some short season hybrids that we do have pretty good data on that seem to be performing quite well that the companies might be more likely to have available. I'm going to switch gears and talk about the focus really of the work this morning, what I'd like to talk about this morning, and that's what we call the 2016 Ultra Early Corn Hybrid Test. And the objective of this test we started this year is to compare the agronomic performance of ultra early hybrids with commonly grown maturities. Basically try to answer the question, what sort of a yield penalty will you incur growing these ultra early hybrids? So we did this study, we conducted it at Wooster and Bucyrus. Bucyrus is in the north central region, Worcester's in our northeastern region. We planted them in the same fields with our Ohio corn performance test. You know, we have 2 tests in our Ohio corn performance test, an early and a late test. Each experiment was replicated 4 times in a split plot, randomized complete block, with maturity as the whole plot factor and hybrid as the subplot. Some background information on these locations. The planting date is kind of late this year, and this is an issue, of course, if you're a cover crop producer and you're trying to use these hybrids, is you have to remember if you do have a late season, you may not see the benefits because of these later planting dates, or the benefits that you'd want to see, as much benefit as you can derive from them. They were planted in May 24th, May 26th. Harvest dates for Bucyrus were October 12th, and for Wooster, we harvested these on 2 different dates. And in the future, this is kind of the approach you want to take. We harvested the earlies on October 10th, and then 16 days later, we came back and harvested the commonly grown maturity checks. So we want to make sure we harvest the earlies when they're appropriate to harvest, because we don't want to have harvest losses of the early hybrids confounding our yield results. We don't want to be harvesting those in early November if we have a late year. Okay, we collected this data: grain yield and test weight, grain moisture at harvest, final stand, stalk rot, stalk lodging, root lodging, foliar diseases, insects, ear rots. And we were lucky at these 2 locations. We didn't experience some of these problems, like the stalk lodging problems that occurred across some areas of the state, foliar disease problems. We didn't have any ear rot problems to speak of. You know, they were minor issues. They were barely detectable. So these 2 locations were blessed without those problems. We had 36 entries in these ultra early corn tests. We had 8 brands: Beck, DeKalb, LG Seeds, Pioneer, Rupp, Seed Consultant, Steyer, and Syngenta. We had 12 entries in the 90 to 95-day range, and that corresponded to 20 based on the seed company literature, 2170 to 2430 GDDs. We had 19 entries in the 96 to 100 day matured range from 2056 to 2450. Again, you'll notice the inconsistency between GDDs and relative maturity, and that's because each company's relative maturity system is a little different, and the GDDs associated with them as a result is different. And then we had 5 checks in the range of 104 to 109 days. And as I mentioned before for the other trial, these were hybrids that were our top yielding hybrids in our corn performance test over a 2-year period. So they had high yield potential. So we weren't comparing these ultra early hybrids to low yielding hybrids, commonly grown hybrids. Just a little background on GDDs, just to show you. I've mentioned this several times, but the relationship of GDDs, heat units, to relative maturities. This is for one company, a single seed corn company. And I just want to point out that within a seed company's lineup, there's usually a pretty good relationship between relative maturities and days. If you stay within a company, you see a pretty good association. It's when you This figure shows the relative relationship of GDDs to relative maturity for all the hybrids that we looked at. And again, here we're looking at relative maturity on the x-axis and heat units on our y-axis. This is where you start seeing more of a scatter, not as close a relationship, because we're looking at these relative maturity ratings that don't necessarily compare consistently with the GDDs because there's different companies involved. This figure shows the relationship of relative maturity to percent moisture at the Bucyrus, the more central region location. You see kind of a scatter of points, but there's definitely evidence for these ultra earlies. The relative maturity again is on our x-axis, percent moistures on the y-axis. You can see that the relative maturity hybrids as a group, lower yielding moistures as low as close to 15%. Then Czech hybrids that were like 104 to 109 day, they're quite a bit wetter, 22, 23, as high as 22, 23%. And if we want to get a feel for those, I put circles around those two different groups. As you can see, a very strong relationship between relative maturity and grain moisture, as our trend line indicates. Okay, here we're looking at the relationship of yield to relative maturity, and this shows you there's quite a bit of scatter here. There's definitely the commonly grown Czechs. They're on the kind of up there in the left. Our commonly grown Czechs definitely have a yield advantage over our ultra early hybrids. But there's a lot of scatter in these points. And if you look here, you can see that, what's interesting is we got, say, a hybrid like a 96-day hybrid, quite a range in that. Hybrid characterized as 96, quite a range in that hybrid's yield potential. But the commonly grown hybrids, it's not as much variability. But certainly this is something you're going to have to keep in mind, that some of these hybrids, probably we're seeing this much variation because they're coming out, they haven't been screened much in Ohio before, so we may be looking at hybrids, say, from northern Michigan, that really aren't adapted to Ohio conditions. So maybe next year or this year, when we repeat the trial, we'll be looking at hybrids that have better adaptation for Ohio. And this figure shows the relationship between yield and grain moisture at the ultra early test at Bucyrus. And again, you can see there's a clear indication of that moisture is higher for those later, fuller season hybrids, lower for the ultra earlies. Strong relationship, just confirming what we saw before. This isn't like our Ohio corn performance test where we didn't see a lot of variability, as much variability. Okay, here's the relationship of relative maturity to percent moisture at Wooster. Now you might say, what's going on here? Because this is a real scatter. It's set up the same way as the other graphs, but at Wooster, as I mentioned before, we harvested our ultra early hybrids 16 days before we harvested our full season hybrids, our Czech hybrids. So basically what we're seeing here is our Czech hybrids that were harvested 16 days later have a range of grain moisture that's comparable to the range of grain moisture you're seeing associated with our earlier hybrids that were harvested 16 days later. So we didn't want to, so this kind of confounds our looking at the relationship directly. What we're planning to do in 2016 when we repeat the test is plant 2 blocks of the commonly grown maturities, so we'll harvest them in 2 different days, yes. That's a good point, yeah. In this case, to some extent, we're kind of interested to see how much variability exists, but down the road, that would be a good way to refine the data, yeah. This figure shows the relationship of yield to relative maturity at Wooster in the northeast region. Again, you can see there's kind of clear evidence that there's two different groups of hybrids as far as yield. The commonly grown maturities have a yield advantage. There's a fairly close, our trend line indicates and our R-square value indicates there's a pretty good relationship between yield and relative maturity here. So by and large, those 90 to 100-day hybrids were yielding considerably less in some cases than our commonly grown maturities. And this table just kind of summarizes what we've been talking about. For our 90, that shows our grain moisture and moisture summary here. The 90 to 95-day hybrids averaged 177 bushels, with yields ranging from 160 to 192, our 96 to 100, 183, 161 to 200, and our commonly grown maturities, 104 to 109, the average was 211, and they were ranging from 202 to 211. The grain moistures I have are just for Bucyrus because that was the one where we harvested them all at the same time. So in summary, the 104, 109 day hybrids out-yielded the ultra-earlies by 15%. The 96 to 100 day hybrids yielded slightly more than the 90 to 95 day hybrids. This figure shows the grain yields of the ultra-early hybrids compared to yields of commonly grown maturities. Now, I have mentioned that in our ultra-early test, we had commonly grown maturities. So I showed you the comparison with 5 of those. In this figure, what I'm showing you is the corn performance test results that were planted in the same fields as the ultra-early tests. So at Bucyrus and at Wooster, we had a corn performance test planted adjacent to the ultra-early test. The red bars here indicate the yield information for our ultra-early hybrids. And the gray bar here indicates the commonly grown maturities that were included in our ultra-early test. Those 2 bars are on the left, and then the 2 bars on the right indicate, the orange and the blue bars indicate the yields information for our Ohio Corn Performance Test early test, that's the orange, and the blue bar indicates the yield information for our Ohio Corn Performance full season test. The number at the top is the average yield for the test. The numbers within the bar are the range in yields, and then the number in parentheses indicates the number of entries we had. So what I'm trying to point out here is the range in yields associated with different tests, with these different tests, our ultra-early test, and then with our corn performance test that was planted adjacent to it, suggests that some of the ultra-early hybrids actually had yields that were similar to the hybrids in our corn performance test. If you look at the range, say at our northwest branch location, or not northwest branch, but Wooster location, the range in yields at the Wooster site were 129 to 170, the 31 ultra-early hybrids we had. And in our Ohio corn performance test, in our early test there, it was 132 to 178. Now, they weren't integrated. This isn't a statistical comparison, but just these data, since they were planted adjacent to each other, does suggest that some of these ultra-early hybrids had yields that seemed to be very similar to the yields that we were getting in our not the top-yielding hybrids in our commonly grown, not the top-yielding hybrids in our corn performance test, but certainly hybrids and average hybrids and average hybrids at the bottom of our commonly grown in our corn performance tests were comparable to those of the ultra-early hybrids. It also points out that when you look at our commonly grown maturities that we included in the ultra-early test were high yielding. They were actually higher yielding than the hybrids that we had in our corn performance test. We just had 5, so we're looking at kind of a skewed number here, but it shows that we weren't looking at hybrids that for our ultra-early checks that were low yielding. We were setting a very high bar. Well, finally, I just wanted to point out some of the differences between these the hybrids, the ultra-early hybrids and our commonly grown checks. This figure shows the difference between the highest and lowest yielding hybrids in bushels per acre for the ultra-early and the common maturity for Bucyrus and Wooster. And the number at the top of these bars indicates the difference in yield between the highest and lowest yielding hybrids. It was 47 and 41 respectively for the 2 trials, compared to 22 for the commonly grown checks, which isn't surprising. The commonly grown checks, we're looking at just 5 hybrids that have high yield potential, so there's that much variability. But the 47 indicates that there's quite a bit of variability among these ultra-early hybrids, and they should probably be, that's a factor, that consideration for growers who are considering ultra-early hybrids. They don't want to pick out a hybrid at the bottom because they're looking at a considerable difference in yield potential that they might be missing out on. And just to follow up on that, we want to look at that in terms of money, dollars per acre, the difference between the highest and lowest yielding hybrids. For the same figure I was showing you before, for Bucyrus, it's about $148. That difference in yield translates to about $148, $117 at Wooster. So again, and those are based on corn price of $3.50 and a drying charge of 3 cents. So about 15.5. So growers looking, if you're picking out a hybrid at the bottom that's not at the top here, you're talking about missing out on some potential profit. Okay, in conclusion then, there are some ultra-early hybrids that have yields comparable to commonly grown maturities based on these very preliminary data. Grain moisture of early hybrids was 3 to 5% lower than the commonly grown maturities. We saw very little lodging, and of course I think 2 locations is just way too early to make any assessment of the stock quality of these hybrids. We just didn't have the lodging pressure present, or the disease pressure, so we really need that type of pressure to make a good assessment. This is, I want to emphasize, very preliminary data. I'm not recommending you go out and plant 3,000 acres to a 79-day hybrid or 90-day hybrid or 100. I would say if you're interested in doing something like that, do it on a very limited scale just to see how it works this year. And some of you may have already tried, may have some information for us. But again, only 2 site years and more performance data is needed. I pointed this out several times, but there seems to be more variability in the yield among the ultra-early hybrids than the commonly grown maturity, which isn't surprising. We haven't evaluated these hybrids much in Ohio. You know, when you take hybrids out of one adaptation region, like say northern Michigan or Wisconsin, and put them in Ohio, some of these hybrids may simply not be adapted to our conditions. I remember many years ago when I looked at a 95-day hybrid in one of our trials where we were looking at GDD accumulations at different planting dates. We got a hybrid that did very well during the trials. We did this over a 3-year period. Then 1 year, it just got clobbered by bacterial blight. Just took it out because the hybrid just didn't have good resistance to that disease. So those factors are important to consider. Harvest grain moistures of early maturity hybrids isn't consistent with maturity ratings, and this is another warning. You know, you may have keep in mind that one company's 104-day hybrid is not another company's 104-day hybrid. One 104-day hybrid may require only 2,300 GDDs to reach maturity. Another one might require 2,400 GDDs. You might even find a 102-day hybrid out there that dries down and has moisture levels that are comparable to a 95-day hybrid. We just don't have a lot of good information on that. So just some other issues that we have to think about down the road if this is a direction that people are interested in pursuing. Looking at seeding rates, you know, you asked about that with the ultra-early hybrids, nitrogen fertility, and then various pest management strategy issues like foliar fungicides and insecticides. You know, if we don't have the disease package that we need. One thing, of course, with some of these ultra-early hybrids, this is one thing that farmers in Manitoba, or the folks from researchers from Manitoba were saying is they don't have the same disease package as hybrids from the Corn Belt further south. Or some of them don't.